Hello. So in this writing notes video, we're going to talk about propaganda and bad faith arguments. Now, unlike a lot of the rhetorical techniques that we've talked about before on this channel, things like Toulmin model arguments, propaganda and bad faith arguments are not meant to get to the truth. They're meant to, in some way, obscure the truth so that an arguer, a rhetor, a speaker can make not necessarily reliable claims. Sometimes this is as simple as outright lies, but more often when we're dealing with propaganda or bad faith arguments, these are techniques used to obscure a speaker's actual meaning. So, let's start with propaganda. What is propaganda? Well, there's a vast amount of theorization material, etc., on propaganda. But basically, propaganda is an ideologically driven impression, or sometimes argument, sometimes not argument, but it's an ideologically driven impression meant to convey a certain worldview. So that's a little obscure. But the idea here is that propaganda is not necessarily intended to represent the truth. It's intended to represent a particular idea. So we tend to think of propaganda in terms of totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany, Stalinist Soviet Union, etc., things like this. But there's also propaganda. There's also other types of propaganda. White nationalist propaganda right now is a huge problem in the U.S., in Western Europe, etc., And the thing that's tricky about propaganda is it's not always overt. So, I mean, you look at a film like Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl. Like, this is very clearly Nazi propaganda. I mean, it's large groups of Nazis marching and glorious, bonfires and whatever kind of shit is in that film. That's very clearly propaganda, but a lot of times propaganda, especially now in the digital age, is much more subtle. So memes, for instance, are a big tool for contemporary white nationalists who will utilize these techniques not to actually make arguments, but to send sort of coded messages. Things that don't seem to overtly be about white nationalism, white supremacy, whatever it is, but for insiders, for people who get the message. This is a repetition of the idea. And that's actually a key thing with propaganda, is that it runs on an economy of repetition. So you repeat an idea over and over and over again, even if it's untrue or even if it's unfounded. The repetition of that idea for believers or for insiders in that movement, that ideology, whatever it is, that repetition makes it true. Again, not in the objective sense of like it's true out in the world, but it's true in the psyche of believers. So this is one of the things. Anti-feminists, we see this as well. A lot of propagandistic work, incels and people like this. There's a lot of propaganda about how terrible women are and things like this. And none of it is actually founded in reality or in actual science. It's bad science, it's bad sociology, etc., because it's there to support an ideological idea rather than an actual search for truth and a weighted assessment of the available evidence. So that's propaganda. It's about strengthening an ideology through the repetition of ideas, the repetition of symbols and signals, rather than the search for truth. Bad faith arguments are related but different. They are also often meant to promote a particular ideology, but a bad faith argument shifts the focus. It substitutes an actual discussion of ideas, facts, policy, whatever it is, for really a discussion of appearances, or a discussion of, almost a discussion of rhetoric. And Aaron Huertas has a really good article on Medium about 7 different types of bad faith arguments, and I'm going to put a link to that down in the description below this. But basically, a bad faith argument shifts our focus from the topic itself to something peripheral. So, a couple of examples of this. What's called moving the goalposts would be a type of bad faith argument. If someone makes a particular argument, say about climate change, and someone objects to that. So let's say person A has made an argument in favor of providing more government subsidies for renewable or green energy in the US because of the climate science that says we need to fucking move on this right now. And another person comes back and says, well, the climate science isn't necessarily clear. If person A then says, actually 97% of publishing climate scientists agree this is an immediate problem, and the other 3% of publishing climate scientists, their work all has substantial errors or substantial missing components. There's something fundamentally flawed about the other 3%, which is actually true. There was a recent study that looked at the 3% of climate studies that have been published recently denying or downplaying climate change. They are all flawed. They all have flawed methodology, but that's not the point. So person A points that out. The climate science is there. There is no serious disagreement in the scientific community. Person B may now say, well, even if that's true, that doesn't prove that we need to provide more subsidies. Now that could, in theory, be a legitimate argument if the goal is let's find the truth of this. But what you're more likely to be dealing with there is someone who's moving the goalposts. And basically what that means is whenever you respond to their ostensible counter-argument and show why that counter-argument is incorrect, they shift to a different position. Because ultimately the goal is not let's find the truth of this, or if you can deal with my objections, I will be persuaded. Ultimately the goal is, my position is we shouldn't have to change anything about consumer lifestyles, industrial activity, fossil fuel usage, whatever it is. And so that's my ultimate perspective. So that's what we get with bad faith arguments, is a lack of interest in actually discussing the issue to come to a resolution. The goal is not to solve the problem. The goal is not to be persuaded. The goal is not to engage in an actual back and forth. The goal is, I refuse to fundamentally accept the argument that you're making or the conclusion that you're coming to, and I will use whatever techniques I have to in order to refuse to accept that. So what's the upshot of this? what's the upshot of sort of knowing that there's propaganda and there are bad faith arguments out there? Well, the problem with propaganda and bad faith arguments from the perspective of someone who is not engaging in propaganda or bad faith arguments is that there's no real use debating them. And this is a tricky thing because sometimes propagandists, bad faith arguers will use similar techniques to what good faith arguments use. But if the person's goal fundamentally is not to be persuaded, not to be convinced, simply to restate the thing that they already believe in without questioning it, interrogating it, considering counter evidence, etc., then you aren't going to convince them. You aren't going to persuade them because they are set against being persuaded. So this is something to be aware of. And in fact, there are ethical arguments that say engaging with propaganda, engaging with bad faith arguments is in itself problematic because it can serve to legitimize these positions if you treat them as though they are real positions that deserve engagement. So there is an argument for simply withdrawing when it becomes clear that a person has no interest in being persuaded, because at the end of the day, they're never going to accept it, so you're wasting your time debating them if your goal is actually to convince them. But because they are not concerned with ever actually resolving the issue, in fact, the longer they can go on propagandizing and making bad faith arguments, the better that is for them, because the more legitimate their perspective looks. And they can create the impression that you haven't been able to defeat them in open debate, therefore their position must have some truth to it. So it actually can play into the propagandist or the bad faith arguer's hands if you engage with them, because then they can say, well, you couldn't out-argue me, so my position must be legitimate. Again, this is a fundamental mistake. I mean, this is a fundamental failure to recognize the difference between I'm ideologically committed to refusing to accept this, any counter-argument, any idea other than what I already believe, versus what I believe must be true. These are not the same proposition. So this is one of the issues that we run into when we're dealing with propaganda and bad faith arguments, is that because they're not invested in the idea of truth or intellectual honesty, they will take anything they possibly can as evidence that their position is correct, even if that evidence is not actually real or true.